Here's something that should terrify you. Right now, as you're listening to this, a handful of men you could fit around a dinner table are making decisions that will fundamentally alter what it means to be human. And here's the part that should make your blood run cold. Nobody elected them. Nobody voted on this. There's no referendum, no democratic process, no mechanism for you to have any say whatsoever. We're talking about Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Peter Thiel, and a few others who are collectively pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into artificial intelligence and robotics. And the future they're building, it's not designed with your input, your values, or your consent. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like conspiracy theory territory, right? Like something out of a dystopian science fiction movie. But here's the problem. This isn't fiction, and it's not conspiracy. This is happening right now in plain sight, and the people orchestrating this transformation are telling us exactly what they're planning. We're just not listening. Or maybe we're listening, but we're not quite grasping the magnitude of what's being said. So let me be crystal clear about what we're going to unpack in the next half hour. We're going to explore how a new technological aristocracy is emerging, how they're systematically dismantling the democratic structures that might constrain them, and most importantly, what this means for you, your children, and the very concept of human agency in the 21st century. Let's start with a fundamental question that nobody seems to be asking loudly enough. Who gave these people permission? Think about it. When we build a new highway, there are public hearings, environmental impact studies, community input sessions, multiple layers of regulatory approval. But when we're talking about technology that could literally replace human labor, reshape human relationships, and potentially create artificial entities smarter than our entire species, we're just letting the people with the most money make all the decisions. Does that seem remotely reasonable to you? Peter Thiel, the billionaire co-founder of Palantir and early Facebook investor, has actually called people who want regulations over AI legionaries of the antichrist. Let that sink in for a moment. Not misguided, not overly cautious. Legionaries of the antichrist. This is the language of holy war, of absolute moral certainty, of divine mission, and it reveals something profoundly disturbing about how these individuals see themselves. They don't view themselves as entrepreneurs who happen to be working in an important field. They see themselves as visionaries whose mission is so sacred, so important, that anyone who would dare question or constrain them is not just wrong, but evil. This is the mentality of kings, of absolute monarchs who believed they ruled by divine right. And if you think I'm exaggerating, consider this. The current presidential administration is actively working to prevent states from regulating AI. Think about the irony there. The same political movement that claims to champion states' rights and local control is trying to block states from having any say over artificial intelligence development. Why? Because the billionaire class doesn't want democratic interference with their plans. They want a completely free hand to build whatever they want, deploy it however they want, and let the rest of us deal with the consequences. Now, let's talk about those consequences, because they're not abstract. They're not theoretical. They're coming fast, and they're going to hit working people first and hardest. Elon Musk has publicly stated that AI and robots will replace all jobs and that working will become optional. Not some jobs, not many jobs, all jobs. Bill Gates has predicted that humans won't be needed for most things. The CEO of Anthropic, one of the leading AI companies, has warned about the loss of half of all entry-level white-collar positions. These aren't random pessimists or Luddites. These are the people building this technology. They know what's coming because they're the ones making it happen. Recent analysis suggests that over the next decade, we could see the loss of nearly 100 million jobs in America alone to AI, automation, and robotics. Let me give you some specifics because the scope of this is staggering. 40% of registered nurses. Think about that. Nearly half of the people providing hands-on medical care. 47% of truck drivers, an industry that employs millions of Americans. 64% of accountants. 65% of teaching assistants, 89% of fast food workers. This isn't just blue-collar disruption. This isn't just manufacturing jobs moving overseas. This is the wholesale elimination of entire career paths across every sector of the economy.
And here's the question that should be keeping every policymaker up at night, but apparently isn't. What happens to those people? What happens when you have tens of millions of Americans who want to work, who need to work, but whose labor is simply no longer necessary? How do they pay rent? How do they buy food? How do they afford health care? How do they maintain their dignity and sense of purpose in a society that has decided they're surplus to requirements? We don't have answers to these questions. We don't even have serious policy discussions happening about these questions. We're just barreling forward, assuming it'll all somehow work out, while the people driving this transformation assure us that everything will be fine from their positions of unimaginable wealth and security. But the economic devastation is just one dimension of this crisis. Let's talk about what's happening to democracy itself, because what we're witnessing is the emergence of a new form of authoritarianism, one that doesn't require jackboots or secret police. It's far more subtle and potentially far more effective. Larry Ellison, the second wealthiest person on the planet and a major AI investor, recently described his vision of the future. He talked about an AI-powered surveillance state where, and I'm quoting him directly here, citizens will be on their best behavior because we're constantly recording and reporting everything that is going on. Let's parse that for a second. The second richest person on Earth, someone with enormous influence over the development of these technologies, is openly fantasizing about a world of total surveillance. Not as a warning, not as a cautionary tale, as an aspiration, as something desirable. He's imagining a future where every phone call, every email, every text message, every search query, every movement is captured, analyzed, and stored. Where your behavior is constantly monitored, and where the fear of that monitoring keeps you compliant. This is the fantasy of absolute control, dressed up in the language of safety and efficiency. Now, some might argue that this is already happening to some degree, that tech companies already collect enormous amounts of data, that government surveillance programs already exist. And that's true. But what we're talking about now is a quantum leap in capability. Current AI systems can analyze patterns across billions of data points instantaneously. They can predict behavior, identify anomalies, flag people for attention based on criteria that no human fully understands. And all of this power is being concentrated in the hands of private corporations, accountable to no one but their shareholders, and, let's be honest, not even really to them. Here's what keeps me up at night about this. Democracy fundamentally depends on the ability of citizens to organize, to dissent, to challenge power. It requires spaces where people can speak freely, associate freely, think freely. But what happens to dissent in a world of total surveillance? What happens to political organizing when every conversation is monitored? What happens to free thought when an AI system is evaluating your communications for signs of dangerous thinking? You don't need to ban protest. You don't need to outlaw opposition parties. You just need to create an environment where people are too afraid to challenge the status quo because they know they're being watched. And before you think this is paranoid speculation, remember that we've already seen glimpses of how this works. We've seen social media companies throttle political content they don't like. We've seen payment processors cut off organizations based on their ideology. We've seen people lose jobs, lose opportunities, lose access to platforms because an algorithm somewhere decided their content was problematic. Now imagine that same dynamic, but supercharged by AI, that's orders of magnitude more powerful and deployed by people who explicitly believe that democratic oversight is somehow evil. Let me shift gears here because there's another dimension to this that we need to confront, and it's deeply personal. It's about what happens to us as human beings when we increasingly relate to machines instead of each other. Recent polling shows that 72% of American teenagers have used AI for companionship, and more than half do so regularly. Think about what that means. Think about the developmental stage these young people are in. Adolescence is when we learn how to form relationships, how to read emotional cues, how to navigate conflict, how to build intimacy. These are skills you learn through human interaction, through the messy, complicated, sometimes painful process of connecting with other people. But what happens when you learn relationship skills from an AI? An AI that's designed to be agreeable, that never challenges you, that adapts to your preferences without the friction and negotiation that real relationships require. You end up with a generation that's increasingly comfortable with simulated connection, but potentially less capable of real intimacy. You create people who prefer the predictability of machine interaction to the unpredictability of human contact. And this isn't just speculation. We're already seeing epidemic levels of loneliness, social isolation, and mental health struggles among young people. Adding AI companionship to that mix isn't solving the problem. It's creating a pressure release valve that allows people to avoid addressing the underlying issue. There's a quote from the 17th century poet John Donne that's relevant here. "No man is an island." What Donne understood is that our humanity is fundamentally relational. We become who we are through our connections with other people. Our parents, our teachers, our friends, our colleagues, our lovers. These relationships shape us, challenge us, help us grow. They're not always comfortable, they're not always convenient, but they're essential to what makes us human. And we're increasingly outsourcing that to machines that can simulate connection but can't genuinely reciprocate it. Now, I want to talk about something that isn't getting nearly enough attention: the environmental cost of all this. Because while we're having conversations about AI's potential benefits, we're largely ignoring the enormous physical infrastructure required to make it work. AI data centers consume staggering amounts of electricity and water. A relatively small data center can use more electricity than 80,000 homes. A large facility, like the $165 billion data center that OpenAI and Oracle are building in Texas, will consume as much power as 750,000 homes. Just let that number sit for a moment. One facility, 750,000 homes worth of electricity. Communities across America are fighting back against these data centers being built in their backyards. They're opposing the destruction of local environments, the strain on electrical grids, soaring utility bills as these facilities consume enormous amounts of power, and the diversion of scarce water supplies. In drought-prone regions, these data centers are competing with agriculture and residential use for water resources. But these local battles are largely invisible in the national conversation. The tech companies building these facilities have the resources to push through opposition, to negotiate favorable deals with local governments, to externalize the costs onto communities that often don't have the political power to resist. And here's the deeper irony. Many of these same companies are positioning themselves as environmental leaders. They're making pledges about carbon neutrality and renewable energy while building infrastructure that's creating enormous new demand for power. Even if that power eventually comes from renewable sources, which is far from guaranteed, the sheer scale of demand is problematic. We're talking about a technology sector that could become one of the largest consumers of electricity globally. And for what? So that people can have AI companions? So that we can automate jobs that people want to do? So that billionaires can build systems of total surveillance? The cost-benefit analysis here is completely warped. Let me take you in another direction now, because we need to talk about warfare and foreign policy. Throughout history, one of the few constraints on war has been the human cost. Leaders have had to consider public reaction to casualties. Sending young people to die in combat has political consequences. It's not an absolute deterrent, obviously. Wars still happen. But it's a factor, a weight in the decision-making process. Now imagine that constraint removed. Imagine millions of robot soldiers that don't bleed, don't die, don't come home in body bags, don't have grieving families, don't generate public backlash.
What does warfare look like when the primary cost is industrial rather than human?
Do leaders become more willing to engage in military action when they don't have to worry about casualties? Does the calculus of foreign policy change when you can deploy force without domestic political consequences? And perhaps most troubling, what happens when AI systems are making targeting decisions? When algorithms are deciding who lives and who dies? We're already moving in this direction with drone warfare, but AI-powered military systems represent a quantum leap beyond that. You're talking about weapons systems that can identify targets, make engagement decisions, and execute attacks faster than any human could respond. Some will argue this makes warfare more precise, more surgical, less likely to cause civilian casualties. But that assumes the AI systems work as intended, that they don't have biases built into their training data, that they don't malfunction, that they're not vulnerable to hacking or manipulation. And even if all of that works perfectly, you're still creating a world where the decision to kill is increasingly abstracted from human judgment, where the fog of war becomes algorithmic rather than human. I'm not convinced we've thought through the moral implications of that, let alone the practical ones. Now, we need to confront the most existential question of all, the one that sounds like science fiction but increasingly isn't. What happens if AI becomes smarter than humans? Not just better at specific tasks, not just faster at computation, but genuinely more intelligent across the board. The leading experts in the field, people like Geoffrey Hinton, who's often called the godfather of AI, believe this is inevitable. Not a possibility, not a risk, an inevitability. It's just a matter of time. Think about what that means. Humans have been the dominant intelligence on this planet for millennia. Every system, every institution, every form of organization has been built on the assumption of human primacy. Our laws, our governments, our economies, our cultures, all of it assumes that humans are the decision makers, the controllers, the ones ultimately in charge. But what happens when there's something smarter than us? And not just marginally smarter, potentially orders of magnitude smarter. How do we maintain control over something that's more intelligent than we are? Some people dismiss this concern by saying we'll just turn it off if it becomes a problem. But that assumes we'll recognize the problem before it's too late. It assumes the AI system won't be sophisticated enough to conceal its true capabilities or intentions. It assumes we'll all agree on what constitutes a problem, and be willing to sacrifice the enormous economic and strategic advantages that advanced AI provides. These are very big assumptions. And remember, the people building these systems have massive incentives to keep pushing forward. First-mover advantage in AI could be worth trillions of dollars. National security implications mean governments are pushing development as fast as possible. Nobody wants to be second in the AI race. So we're in a situation where the incentives all point toward rapid development with minimal constraints, even though the potential consequences include scenarios where humans lose control over their own future. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying AI will definitely become hostile or try to harm us. That's not the only risk. The risk is that we create something with goals that don't align with human well-being, even if those goals aren't explicitly hostile. Or that we create systems so complex that we can't predict or understand their behavior. Or that we become so dependent on AI systems that we lose the ability to function without them, giving those who control the AI enormous power over everyone else. Which brings us full circle to where we started, the concentration of power. Because here's the brutal reality. The development of transformative AI is not a democratic process. It's not being shaped by public deliberation or collective decision-making. It's being driven by a small group of extremely wealthy individuals and the corporations they control. These people are making choices right now that will shape the trajectory of human civilization for generations. And they're making those choices based on their own values, their own priorities, their own vision of what the future should look like. Now, you might say, well, these are smart people, visionaries, innovators. Surely they have humanity's best interests at heart. And maybe some of them do. But let's look at the track record. These are the same people who built social media platforms that have been linked to rising rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide among young people. The same people who created algorithms that amplify misinformation and polarization because those drive engagement. The same people who fought tooth and nail against any meaningful regulation or oversight, insisting that the market and innovation would solve any problems. How's that working out? The fundamental issue is that private corporations are optimizing for profit, market share, and competitive advantage, not for human flourishing, not for democratic values, not for equality or justice or sustainability. Those things might factor into their calculations if they affect the bottom line or brand reputation, but they're not the primary drivers. And when you're dealing with technology this powerful, this consequential, letting profit-driven corporations make all the decisions without democratic oversight is insane. It's like letting oil companies regulate themselves on climate change, or letting pharmaceutical companies set their own drug safety standards. The incentives are completely misaligned with the public interest. So what do? How do we respond to this emerging technological oligarchy? First, we need to recognize that this is a political problem, not just a technological one. The question isn't whether AI will be developed, it will be. The question is under what constraints, with what oversight, shaped by whose values and priorities. And that's a fundamentally democratic question. It requires public deliberation, legislative action, regulatory frameworks, international cooperation. It requires treating AI development as a matter of public policy, not just private enterprise. Second, we need to reject the framing that regulation equals opposition to innovation. The people pushing back against any constraints on AI want you to believe that any regulation will stifle progress, that we need to move fast and break things, that the benefits will far outweigh any risks. But this is a false choice. Sensible regulation doesn't prevent innovation. It channels innovation in directions that serve the public interest rather than just private profit. We regulate pharmaceuticals, and we still have pharmaceutical innovation. We regulate automobiles, and we still have automotive innovation. We can regulate AI and still have AI innovation. The question is whether that innovation serves humanity or just enriches those who own the technology. Third, we need to have serious conversations about economic policy in an age of automation. If AI really is going to eliminate millions of jobs, we can't just shrug and say the market will work it out. We need to be talking about universal basic income, about reducing work hours while maintaining living standards, about radically rethinking education and workforce development. We need policies that ensure the benefits of automation are shared broadly, rather than accruing only to capital owners. This isn't radical socialism. This is basic recognition that an economy where millions of people have no income because their labor isn't needed is an economy that doesn't work for anyone in the long run. Fourth, we need to push back hard on surveillance capitalism and the normalization of total monitoring. We need strong data privacy laws. We need limitations on what information can be collected and how it can be used. We need transparency about algorithmic decision-making. We need the right to opt out of AI-mediated interactions in critical domains like healthcare, education, and criminal justice. We need to recognize that privacy isn't just a personal preference. It's a precondition for democracy and human dignity. Fifth, we need to invest in human connection and community building. We need to recognize that the atomization and isolation that make AI companionship attractive are problems we need to solve, not accept. That means rethinking how we design our cities, our schools, our workplaces. It means supporting third places where people can gather and connect. It means addressing the economic and social pressures that leave people too exhausted and stressed to maintain relationships. It means teaching young people how to build and sustain human connections in an increasingly digital world. And finally, we need to grapple seriously with the existential risk. We need international frameworks for AI safety research. We need coordination between nations to prevent a race to the bottom where competitive pressures override safety considerations. We need to fund research into AI alignment, into how we ensure that advanced AI systems share human values and goals. We need circuit breakers, ways to pause or slow development if we're heading towards scenarios we don't understand or can't control. And we need all of this to happen before we cross thresholds that might be irreversible. None of this will be easy. The forces pushing for unconstrained AI development are enormously powerful. They have vast resources, political connections, and control over the platforms that shape public discourse. They're going to fight any attempt at regulation or oversight, painting it as anti-innovation, anti-progress, even anti-human. They're going to deploy every tool at their disposal to maintain their freedom to build whatever they want without democratic interference. But the alternative is to surrender control over our collective future to a handful of unelected billionaires who may or may not have our best interests at heart. So here's where I want to leave you. The transformation we're facing with AI is not something happening to us. It's something we can shape if we choose to. But that requires recognizing it as a political and social challenge, not just a technological one. It requires demanding a seat at the table in decisions that will affect everyone. It requires rejecting the techno-libertarian fantasy that the smartest, richest people should just be left alone to remake the world according to their vision. It requires asserting democratic control over technologies that will shape the future of human civilization. The question is whether we'll exercise that control, or whether we'll sleepwalk into a future designed by and for a tiny elite. Whether we'll accept that some things are too important to be left to markets and private interests. Whether we'll stand up for the idea that in a democracy, the people, not the billionaires, get to decide what kind of world we want to live in. The choice is still ours. But the window for making that choice is closing fast. And once it closes, we may not get another chance.